If you were a gardener in 2020, do you remember all that time you had on your hands? With the exception of those working harder than anyone, like those in healthcare, many of us were able to spend copious amounts of time in our garden planning and in creating our gardens. But now, 5 years later, many of us would say that we are busier than ever. Yet, because you're listening today, you're still gardening. These days, time is the biggest hindrance to the garden that you want and dream for this year. But what if you could leverage technology to cut that garden planning time significantly? What if, in the time that you do give your garden, you're able to spend it doing what excites you? And that the more tedious planning tasks could get done by a simple stroke of keys. I'll be honest, I am behind in my garden planning this year, more so than I've ever been. But I've been able to use the method that I'm sharing with you today to get things done much faster than ever before. By the end of this episode, you'll have easy hacks to help you do the same and even more. Welcome to a special Friday episode of the Beginner's Gardening Podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about simple ways that you can leverage the power of AI to make your garden planning faster than ever. But before we get there, I want to make sure you know that Dream to Garden, my online garden planning course, is now open for enrollment. In this 4-module course, you'll go from a dream to a planned out garden ready for you to plant and grow. And new for 2025, we have incorporated a new AI component that will make getting through and accessing the content of the course so much easier if you choose to use it. More on that later, but to learn more about Dream to Garden and join the over 1,000 students already in the course, go to journeywithjill.net/dream2garden, and we'll have that link in the show notes. Now back to what we're talking about today. My guess when I say AI or ChatGPT, some kind of emotion comes to mind. Maybe you've seen how it can assist you in ways that you could only have dreamed of and you are all in. But maybe you're skeptical and a bit nervous. Frankly, the bigger AI conversation still makes me a bit wary, especially when we look at how fast this is developing and what it might mean for the future. But today, I'm not talking about worst case scenarios. I'm talking about using ChatGPT as a hyped up search engine. Think Google on steroids. Or think about how much faster you can turn a screw with a drill as compared to a screwdriver. That's what we're talking about here today. So with that in mind, I would like to share with you 8 ways that you can use the free version of ChatGPT in particular to streamline your garden planning. And yes, it is free. All you have to do is sign up for an account. Now, if you're new to ChatGPT, there are 2 things that you need to know. And this is really important, especially when we're talking about something as important as planning our garden and growing our own food. Number 1, it's basically a hyper-power search engine, scraping millions of sites in seconds to create an answer. Instead of asking Google a question and then skimming through a handful of websites, whichever ones Google deems to be most relevant to you, instead it actually aggregates all the information that it can find online for you. And if you ask it to, it will link to the source. So you can go back and double check the answers. That leads to number 2. The answers that we get using ChatGPT are only as good as the information that it scrapes off of the web. So it's not infallible, and you'll always want to consider each answer with a critical eye. Because if there's bad information online, that bad information can get into your answers. So always keep that in mind. It's not infallible. But keeping those 2 things top of mind, knowing that I'm talking about a hyper search engine, but we also need to double check it with our own intellect. This is a fascinating way that you can shave so much time off of your garden planning. And some of these things that I've been playing around with, I have been so amazed. It saved me so much time. And this is just the beginning. I'm hoping that giving you these 8 examples will get your mind going, and then you can come up with others that work for you and then share them with me so that we can all become a little bit more efficient. Let's talk about 8 prompts that you can ask ChatGPT just like you would a Google search, and how this can shave off time with your garden planning. Number one, something super simple, and this is especially going to be relevant for you if you're a beginner, is a simple query that says, what is my average last frost date? If you have done any kind of research on your average last frost date, you know that different websites have different responses sometimes. Usually they're all around the same general time, but I've heard from some people, especially Dream to Garden students, that in some areas they can be quite off. And the difference is because different sites use different dates. They have different data sets that they draw from. They may have gone the last 20 years or the last 30, or maybe their last time they scraped data was 2010. You never know what the sites are. So instead of having to look at like 5 different sites to get an idea of what your average last frost date is, if you ask ChatGPT, what is my average last frost date, and then you put in your zip code, then it's going to give you an answer back. When I did this, it gave me a range of about 5 days. I think it said April 1st through 5th or 5th through 8th or something like that. I can't remember, but that 100% tracks with everything I've been able to find online in just a second, instead of having to look through all these different sites. So that's the first thing that I would suggest. Number 2, and those who are current members of Dream to Garden will recognize this, and this is super helpful because I've got a whole video that shows you how to find this out manually, and you can do it by a simple search. And that is, when do we reach 85 degrees and higher on average? Now, this is a key date, and if you were part of the Productive Gardener's Blueprint workshop, then this is going to sound familiar to you, or if you're a member of Dream to Garden. 85 degrees is the temperature at which, above this, some of our warm season crops are going to have trouble fruiting. Like tomatoes have trouble fruiting over 85 degrees. Sometimes green beans, especially pole beans, can do the same. It's basically when some of our crops start to suffer. And this is important, especially in those of us who have long periods where we get 85 degrees and above, because we want to plan our gardens around this. For example, I want to try to get most of my tomatoes to be setting fruit before this date actually occurs, so that way I can get a better tomato harvest. If I wait too long and the tomatoes are starting to fruit in that period where we're above 85 degrees, then it is not going to do as well for the harvest. So that's why it's really important to know those dates. Again, I go into much more detail into that in Dream to Garden. But again, finding out when your dates are for the average of when you get 85 degrees and above, and this is a range, mine's like 2 months long, can take some time to figure that out. But this is a question you can answer quickly. When do we reach 85 degrees and higher? And it will give you a range right off the bat. So you can see that this is just an easy way to ask a simple question and it will spit out an answer. Another simple one, what is my latitude? Now, this is also a simple Google search. I've done that too, but it's important to understand what our latitude is so that we can choose the right varieties of onions to be able to plant. But I did this myself to get an idea of what ChatGPT might spit out. And I asked, what is my latitude? And I asked what types of onions are best for me to grow. And it mainly gave me good information. It did recommend intermediate day varieties, which do well, and some long day varieties, which can do okay, but it actually said I shouldn't grow short day onions. Well, in my experience, short days do have a tendency to bolt sooner. They're not as dependable, but they're not a no-go by any means. And I've actually been able to start growing them in the fall into the spring, and it's been working well. So this is an example of where, yes, it's generally good information, but it's not 100% infallible, and you as a gardener will want to continue to test. But for basic information, this will definitely get you started. Number 4 is something I am really excited about because this is the one that has saved me so much time, and it's actually answered some questions that I didn't know how to get answers to in the past. And that is when it comes to what kind of perennial fruit in particular that I can grow. Now, we're going to be talking more about growing fruit in the next few weeks, but let me give you an example of a query that I gave that I found was very helpful. I just simply wrote in, after sharing my zip code and my climate, I said, what perennial varieties of apples are most successful in my climate? And it gave me a list of varieties that are supposedly best for my climate. But I also knew, and this is why the power of AI is only as good as knowing how to ask it questions. I also knew that disease resistance is a big deal for apples in particular. So I followed up with that question and I said, what disease issues are a problem in my climate? Because there's lots of different diseases in any kind of crop, but what is most pervasive in your climate? That's really helpful to know. So it started listing out the different diseases. And so then I asked, knowing what diseases are present in my climate, what varieties are going to be the best options? And then I also added, what about pollination? Because I knew that apples will need to have a pollinator. So what it ended up doing is it gave me a list of the best disease-resistant apples for my climate and which varieties would best pollinate each other. And then it asked me, would you like me to show you where to buy these varieties? Which was huge because I have done a little bit of research on these varieties before, and I've looked at different websites, and maybe one website has one variety but it doesn't have the other. But this actually gave me lists of where I could buy these particular varieties online, which I found was really interesting and very helpful if I'm wanting to grow more types of perennials and make a good choice on what varieties are going to be best in my climate. This is something I also played around with blueberries. I said, what blueberries are the best to grow in my climate? And it gave me a bunch of different options. But one thing that I really liked is it told me, if you want high production and heat resistance, go with Premier and Brightwell or Tiff Blue and Powder Blue. And Premier, Brightwell, and Tiff Blue are some of my favorites. So they already got that right. But then it says, if you need self-pollinating compact bushes, try Sunshine Blue. So you could even say, I don't have a large space, or I'm going to be growing these in containers. What would you suggest? And it will give you different varieties that you could potentially look at. Now, I always recommend double checking, looking at your university extension websites just to make sure. But from what I found with these queries, they were right on the money with these perennial crops. So to me, this is a huge benefit in saving time. Number 5, this is something that I used with my seed buying, and that is a quick check to see where I can find the best seed prices for a particular variety. I can buy from 5, 6, 7 different seed sources, and sometimes I will choose a particular variety, but many of those seed sources have it too. And what I've had to do in the past is go and say, okay, this is how much does it cost and this is how many seeds are in it, and then trying to figure out what the best price is for the volume that I'm getting. And as you can imagine, it's just doing simple math, but it takes a long time, especially if you're buying a lot of different varieties. So for this, I decided to test it. And this was the exact query that I put in. I wrote, I want to buy Golden Acre cabbage. I prefer to purchase from one of these seed sources: Baker Creek, Southern Exposure, Seed Savers Exchange, Territorial Seeds, Johnny Seeds, True Leaf Market, In My Gardener, Botanical Interest, or Park Seed. Where can I get the best price for the quantity? So what ChatGPT does is it scrapes all of their websites, and what it gave me was a chart. It gave me a chart that showed the seed source, the quantity, the price per seed, and the link where I could purchase it. And then it summarized it and said, considering both total cost and quantity, In My Gardener provides a cost-effective option with 300 seeds for $2. However, if you're looking for the lowest price per seed and a larger quantity, Southern Exposure Seed Exchange is the best choice. So in just one quick query, that saved me 5 or 10 minutes worth of seed price comparing. I thought that was very, very helpful. Another way that I use this going along with buying seeds is trying to decide if a particular seed company is reputable. I have had the experience of being burned by bad seed experiences. I've actually had it only happen once, and after that, I'm really careful with where I buy my seeds from. But there was a particular variety of bell pepper that I needed the seed for, and I couldn't find it in any of my regular sources. A garden friend of mine and I were both searching for it. It's called Intruder bell pepper. It had really good disease resistance and did really well in both of our gardens. And he and I have shared different seeds in the past, but we couldn't find it. So I asked ChatGPT, I said, where can I find seeds for intruder bell pepper? And it gave me 2 different websites. The websites looked great. It wasn't super expensive, but I'd never heard of these websites before. So then I asked ChatGPT, is such and such a reputable seed source online? And it basically said no. It has very low reviews and people said this, this, and this. And both of those seed sources that it had found for me for this intruder bell pepper, neither of them were reputable. I'd never heard of them before, no telling what kind of site it was. And so I was really grateful that even asking that helped me to save myself from another bad experience. So even just asking. Now, I decided to test it because there are the other seed companies that I mentioned that I use. I was curious, like, does ChatGPT think those are reliable seed sources? And I put them in and they're like, yes, they're a reliable seed source. And here's why, and all of this. And I'm like, okay, I can trust it then, at least at that point. So that was really helpful for me with buying seeds, and it saved a lot of time and it helped me feel more confident in the decisions I was making. Prompt number 7, this is another simple one, but it's one that can be really helpful when we're planning our gardens and deciding how long is a certain crop going to be in the garden space. This is helpful for succession planting. Again, this is something that we talked about in the workshop a week or 2 ago, and I go into detail in Dream to Garden, and that is days to maturity. It's really important when we're planting our gardens to know how long is this tomato plant going to be in our garden? How long are these bush beans going to be there before we harvest it? Because we might have time to plant another planting of something else behind it. So you can just ask quickly, what is the days to maturity of this, of lettuce? And then you could, if you say lettuce, it'll probably give you a range, like 40 to 65 days. But you could even go to the variety level. What's the days to maturity of this variety of lettuce? And it'll spit something out. But it also can go a little bit deeper. And if you were in the workshop or if you're in Dream to Garden, you know that I talk about an option of planting called staggered planting. And this is where you plant different varieties of one crop, let's say it's carrots, and you plant them all at the same time, but they have different days to maturity, so you have a longer harvest window. So you'll be harvesting for a lot longer because the varieties come to maturity at different times. So this is an example that I gave ChatGPT. I said, if I want to plant one planting of carrots, but choose 3 varieties that will mature at different times in order to get a continual harvest throughout the summer, what 3 varieties for my climate that I can buy from the seed sources listed above would you suggest? And the answer was actually 3 that I typically do grow, and that is Littlefinger, Scarlet Nantes, and Danvers 126. And then it also gave sources to where to buy them. So I thought that was a really helpful thing, especially if you're new to staggered planting. It can give you some good basic varieties to start out with. And then finally, prompt number 8 is choosing specific varieties based on season. You've heard me talk about, if you've been on the podcast before, about how I grow lettuce and greens year round for my salads. And one of the keys to doing that is growing cold tolerant varieties over the winter and growing warmer tolerant varieties over the spring and summer. And what I could do here, especially if you're new, you don't know what varieties are more cold tolerant or warm tolerant, so you could ask it. For example, I asked, what are 3 most cold tolerant lettuces? And then I said, from the seed sources I listed before, because I already gave it which seed sources I wanted to buy from. And it gave me 3 different options: Landis, Winter Density, and Rouge de Vert. Winter Density is one I always do use. Rouge de Vert I've heard good things about. Landis is one I'd never heard of before, so it might be a good option. And then on the other hand, I asked, what are 3 most heat-tolerant lettuces from the seed sources above? And it gave me options of Jericho Romaine, Paris Island Cos, and Butter Crunch. And the latter 2 I have grown in my garden too, so those are kinds that I am very familiar with. But again, it was really easy for me to just ask these questions to be able to spit out different options. And you can just see, hopefully, how much time all of this can save just to get into the habit of prompting ChatGPT to answer some basic questions. Now, is it planning your entire garden for you? No. And that leads me to something that I decided to test because I was like, okay, how good is this thing? Because I was thinking one question that's very common for a lot of us is companion planting. So for fun, I asked what companions would work with zucchini. I personally don't do a whole lot of companion planting with zucchini because it gets really large. And the answers that it spat out at me were not bad. And some of them, like nasturtium or radish, I have used in the past. So I don't think that they were actually terrible suggestions. But it also suggested some that I wouldn't have chosen. It suggested oregano and thyme. I personally prefer to keep my perennial herbs like those in a different place compared to my annual garden. That's something that I talk about more in Dream to Garden, why that's important to me. But it did have some options that I wouldn't personally choose. So I had to go and kind of be like, okay, yeah, that works, but that might not. But then I decided to go a little bit farther. And well, actually, it had asked me, it said, do you want me to create a layout for you? And I'm like, you're going to be able to create a garden layout for me? And I said yes. And so it created a layout with all the plants, with zucchini and all the companion plants that it had identified in a 4x8 raised bed. But as I looked at that layout, it looked all cute with all the little clip art and all of that. That's when it became problematic. Because here are just some examples of some things that it put in that 4x8 raised bed. Number one, it put 4 corn plants in that raised bed. 2 were across the top and 2 were across the bottom. Number one problem with that is that planting 4 corn plants, you're probably not going to get 4 ears of corn because the pollination is not going to be there. I recommend a minimum of 16. Number 2, if you put 2 corn plants in the front and 2 across the back, then that's going to eventually shade all the rest of the plants because the corn's going to grow really tall. So that would have been a really bad idea in my opinion. Another thing that it did is it had 2 squares in like a square foot garden method of bush beans on either side of the zucchini. Number one, having 2 squares of bush beans is not going to be enough for much of a harvest. I mean, you might get 1 dinner out of that perhaps, but more than that, the zucchini is going to outgrow those bush beans and probably overtake them as close together as it had listed in this garden layout. Another thing is it had carrots interspersed throughout this garden plan. And if they were planted where ChatGPT suggested, they would have gotten shaded and they wouldn't have produced like I expected them to. So here was the lesson that I learned from this little test of ChatGPT is it's a good consultant. It provides inspiration, but be careful following without knowing the whys behind the what. Because if you're a brand new gardener and you said create a layout, you wouldn't have known that about corn perhaps, or about bush beans or carrots. You may not have known those things that might have made it not work for you. So you have to be really careful how much you trust it, especially if you're a beginning gardener. But if you have some experience and you have some discernment built up, then you can obviously look at certain things to be able to know, well, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's try this. I had never thought of that. Or don't know about that one exactly. Now, I've mentioned that my online garden planning course, Dream to Garden, is open. And one thing that I have created that is brand new this year, it's an option. If all this AI stuff is overwhelming to you, it's not something you have to use. You still get the course that you can go through like we've had for the last 4 years, or 5. Anyway, but if you are interested in saving time with AI, I've created a Dream to Garden companion custom GPT. And what this does is it only borrows from the Dream to Garden course and all the bonuses, including my course Companion Planting 101. And you can ask questions and it will only borrow, the default would be to only borrow from the course. So you don't have to worry about having bad information that is on the web because it's coming just from the course. And for example, I decided to use my custom GPT to ask it to create a garden layout. So I wrote in the Dream to Garden Companion, again, this is the custom GPT that Dream to Garden members will get. I wrote, provide me a 4x8 garden layout using the principles in this course where I'm planting tomatoes, peppers, basil, carrots, and lettuce. I was amazed. I was testing it. I just did this yesterday. It took into account the placement and the shade. It put tomatoes on the north side, which is something that I would recommend, and I do recommend in Companion Planting 101 to take into consideration the shade. And then it put carrots on the south side so that it could get plenty of sun. And it already knew to do that. It also suggested a continual sowing of lettuce for a continual harvest for succession planting. So it absolutely took into account many of the principles in Dream to Garden and created a ready-made layout that is one that I would put in my garden with maybe just a couple of tweaks. It had all the carrots on one side and all the lettuces on the other, and I like a little variety, so I would have mixed and matched those, but that's not a deal killer. Everything else was perfect. Now, this is only one example of what this custom GPT within the Dream to Garden course can do. It can calculate planting times based on, once you figure out your average last frost date, you can say, when should I plant broccoli? Or is it too late to plant this? And it'll tell you yes or no based on the course. It suggests succession plantings. So if I say my squash is going to be done by July 1st, then what can I plant afterwards before a fall harvest? And it would give different suggestions for succession planting. It also will do plant spacing. If you're planting, you're like, oh, I forgot, how far apart do I need to plant tomatoes? It'll tell you. And not only that, we have had 3 years of coaching calls where every month I've been answering questions from students, and we have transcribed that and uploaded that into the ChatGPT. And that is just filling the knowledge base to be able to ask regular garden questions, such as, what do I need to do to prevent cabbage worm? I tried that, and it takes from, this is a hot topic in our coaching calls usually, and it takes from that and it answers it for you. So I feel like this is going to make it so much easier for Dream to Garden students to get your garden planned, but also to have ready-made answers that you know that you can trust available for you throughout the garden season. To me, leveraging ChatGPT, whether you do it through the custom GPT I just talked about, or whether you just do the free account like we've talked about most of this episode, is just another tool that can help me to be more efficient in my garden. But as I hope that you hear me say, with any tool, we need to be careful about how we use it. So I hope that these prompts get you curious about leveraging this free tool for your garden as you see fit. And if you're in Dream to Garden, I hope that you find this new Dream to Garden companion helpful as you plan your garden. Whatever helps us to grow more with less stress, to me, is a win. So to learn more about Dream to Garden and to enroll in the February enrollment, it's only open for a few more days. Then you can go to journeywithjill.net/Dream to Garden, and I hope to see you in the course. But whether or not you are a member of Dream to Garden, I hope that this episode has been helpful for you to try to help you get answers quicker and to leverage AI in a way that will help your garden be even more successful and enjoyable this season. Thank you so much for joining me today on this special Friday episode, and I will chat with you again on Tuesday.